To start things off, I just want to say thank you to everyone for the response on the first video. It's been nothing but love from all of you guys, and frankly, that means the world to me. Since I don't want to make you guys wait too long between releases, I've decided to whip up a shorter video on a topic I've been thinking about for some time now. With that being said, let's get right into it. If you have any familiarity with the Pokemon TCG, you might have heard someone refer to their card as a mid-era card, or their collection on the whole as a mid-era collection. This may cause some of you who are unfamiliar to ask the question, what does mid-era even mean anyway? To begin with, the mid in mid-era is not in reference to the idea of something being mid, or average. Mid-era refers to cards that belong in the middle era of the TCG. You see, Pokemon collectors like to divide the Pokemon TCG in its many sets into three distinct eras: Vintage, Mid-era, and Modern. Vintage is in reference to the original sets. These are your base sets, your jungles, fossils, you get the idea. Modern is in reference to the newer sets, like your Evolving Skies, your Crown Zeniths, and your Prismatic Evolutions. I've got my eyes on you. Some people like to categorize things differently, like calling the newest generations of Pokemon cards the post-modern era, or calling the vintage cards the WotC era, in reference to the company Wizards of the Coast, who printed the original two generations of Pokemon cards out here in the States. But in general, these three eras are the ones most collectors divide the many generations of Pokemon into. So how do we actually divide up the generations of Pokemon into each of the eras? You may be thinking to yourself that the process is simple. After all, there's 9 generations of Pokemon and 3 eras of cards, so dividing it should look something like this, right? Gens 1 through 3 in Vintage, 4 through 6 in Mid-era, and 7 through 9 in Modern. That would make the most sense on how to divide things. Hey, if this question is so easy to answer, how come this video is so long anyway? Okay, so it's actually not that simple. You see, while everyone is in agreement that Gens 1 and 2 are considered Vintage, and Gens 8 through 9 are considered Modern, basically every other generation has something worth discussing in terms of its placement on this list. See, what you don't realize until you start digging into the weeds is that the term mid-era in and of itself is kind of a misnomer, and that what Pokemon collectors consider mid-era is incongruous with what one might perceive the term to imply. Because of this, I wanted to go gen by gen and see where people typically place each generation in terms of its era, why the cards are placed in that era, what are the arguments for or against that placement, etc. Before we get started, I do want to preface things by saying that I am not definitively categorizing what gen goes into what era, and so on. While my opinions are obviously going to play a part in how each generation is presented, I'm going to try to be as fair and balanced as possible in presenting each generation's case for each of the eras they're commonly associated with. Also, keep in mind I'm not going to present a definitive conclusion at the end of this video where I show like a final list with everything laid out all nice and tidy. After running through this script a few times, I've determined there isn't a good standardized list we can use that I would have been satisfied with. If you've got your own list for the different generations, let me know in the comments. Okay, I think I've done enough beating around the bush. Let's get started on the gen by gen discussion, starting with Gen 3 might be the most controversial generation in this list. You see, when people refer to a card as mid-era, 99.999 billion% of the time, they are referring to a card from this generation. Doesn't matter if it's an e-reader card, an EX card, a reverse stamp, a Delta species, if it's from Gen 3, it is likely being viewed as a mid-era card. In fairness, I think there is merit to separating these cards from vintage ones. Gen 3 cards look noticeably different from their Gen 2 counterparts. Gen 3 was also the first time Pokemon Company themselves had direct involvement with the printing process of their cards, sans their relationship with Wizards of the Coast. And Gen 3 was the first generation to officially remove the first edition moniker from cards. What's a first edition card? I hear none of you say? I'm so glad you didn't ask. Let me explain. Basically, when a set is complete and the first batch of cards is being printed, what some companies like to do is label those cards as first edition cards. When these cards are then printed a second, third, or fourth time, they'll be printed without the first edition label. These cards are considered to be unlimited cards, because companies print these versions of the cards until demand is satisfied. You might be wondering why they don't print each of the different editions with different stamps, like how it's done on books. And I think the reason for this is simple. No one wants to be stuck with a 9th edition base set Weedle. Okay, back to the topic at hand. Gen 3 has a lot separating it from Gens 1 and 2, so calling it by a different term makes sense. But if it's an understandable labeling, and it's what people associate the mid-era with in the first place, why do people argue against Gen 3 being mid-era? Let's start with the easy cases against Gen 3. To begin with, people who know the TCG might have already pointed out that Gen 3 was not the first generation of cards to have sets without the first edition labeling. Base Set 2 from Gen 1 and Legendary Collection from Gen 2 also didn't have first edition stamps. Although seeing as both were reprint sets with no new cards in them, it's likely they removed the first edition stamp to avoid confusion. Even beyond those sets, however, the E-Reader series also didn't have the first edition stamping. The E-Reader series is in and of itself kind of a weird edge case that, trust me, we will get into later. But for the time being, I'll just say that Gen 3 lacking first edition cards isn't inherently enough reason to separate these cards from their Gen 1 and 2 counterparts. Additionally, while Gen 3 was Pokemon Company's first time printing cards in the TCG, in the OCG, they had been involved in the printing from the very first set, meaning the idea that Pokemon's presence in the printing process signified a new era for the card game only really applies to the English version of these cards. While Gen 3 cards do look pretty different from Gen 1 cards, they do also look remarkably similar to E-Reader cards. Same borders, reverse foil pattern, general layout. It's hard to look at these cards and not see what they have in common. So even though Generation 3 will bring new ideas to the table later on in its lifespan, its foundation does clearly show inspiration taken from where previous gens left off. Lastly, actually, before we bring up the last point, let's take a moment to discuss the idea of something being vintage in the first place, since we're already skating over the first two generations anyway. To a lot of people, 20 years is generally the amount of time it takes for something to be considered vintage. That could be in reference to anything from games, to fashion, advertisements, so on and so forth. 20 years is the minimal amount of time before vintage starts getting thrown around in discussions of a product's age. That being said, do I believe 20 years is a golden rule that we should always follow? No, not particularly. For example, would I consider a Tom Brady rookie card to be vintage? A Jim Rice rookie? Sure. But good old kiss on the lips Tom? Definitely not. Similarly, would I call a comic from 2005 vintage? No, I don't think so. While 20 years is a good rule of thumb to begin considering something as vintage, I think there are some categories of item where the label feels ill-suited. Comics have been around for close to a century now, same with sports cards. So labeling what are still relatively recent items in these categories as vintage due to an arbitrary rule feels kind of off. With all that said, Pokemon is still a very new franchise, being part of a medium that itself is still very new compared to the likes of books and film. Pokemon's TCG started in late 1998, barely being allowed to call itself a 90s kid. So with that in mind, I think we can all agree that any card older than 20 years is at the very least a strong contender for the vintage conversation. Any card. Any of them. Any and every single one of them. Okay, you know what? I'm done being nice about it. What I'm trying to say is we are old people. We're old. Fossils. 3 feet in the dirt. Keyboard cat.
Lots and lots of trade.
He's a phantom.
Animal crackers in my soup.
Love 15.
Coming soon to own on video and DVD.
Hi, I'm Cole Sprouse, and you're watching Disney Channel.
Chia Pets, the pottery that grows.
Did any of that make you feel anything? That's because you are old. We are the last generation to know what it is like to grow up without an iPad in our face straight out of the womb. We're old. What I'm trying to say is, I think we need to at least consider the notion of Gen 3 being a part of the vintage category. Yes, I understand there are later sets in the EX series that are younger than 20 years. And yes, I get it feels weird saying that your childhood generation is vintage, and yes, I understand that mid-era was likely created to denote Gen 3 cards specifically. But let's be real, people. Every day that we walk on this mortal coil, that statement grows further and further from the truth. As we age out and become the old guard, the generation of kids after us are going to have less and less nostalgia for the e-readers, in the same way that we have less nostalgia for the base set cards. Everyone's favorite anything is going to be whatever they grew up with, and no one wants to be the first to admit that they've become old and busted and are no longer the new hotness. I'm not going to be putting anything into any category myself, but just know that with each passing day, that separation between vintage and mid-era grows further and further from people's minds.
A new power has surfaced.
Gen 4 is simultaneously somehow in a far safer spot than Gen 3 was, yet a far scarier spot for me specifically. See, I vaguely remember Gen 3, like, I was around to experience it on an objective level, but in terms of truly retaining any memories of my early experience with Pokemon, Gen 4 was my true introduction to the series. So the thought of my generation needing to even have this kind of discussion in the first place is frankly kinda scary. That being said, I don't think there's anyone that wouldn't consider Gen 4 as being mid-era. Diamond and Pearl came out in 2007, which while barely reaching the cutoff, is still definitely not vintage. Plus, the actual titles that represent the middle of the series, Black and White, are only one generation removed from Gen 4. So unless you only count Gen 5 as mid-era, then it's safe to say that this generation is a mid-era series as well. If you're wondering why I'm discussing it then, the reason that I wanted to focus this next section on it is because I wanted to introduce the concept of the divide, since it's something we're going to need to discuss every time a set enters the vintage conversation. In essence, the divide is the point where you can't comfortably categorize the generation into an era cleanly. In my opinion, once a generation has reached somewhere around 60% busted status, is when it's eligible to enter the divide. Gen 3, as you can no doubt tell, has already breached this point, if my previous discussion on it didn't clue you into its current status. But I want to expand on this idea in greater detail. See, by the end of this year, 11 of the 16 Gen 3 sets will be over 20 years old. By 2026, that number will grow to 15 of the 16 sets. Because of this, Generation 3 is in a state of limbo. Too young to definitively call it vintage, but too old to not at least consider the notion. Gen 4 was also split into 16 sets, but unlike Gen 3, Gen 4 is subdivided by game releases in a way that other gens aren't. Diamond and Pearl, Platinum, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver are all considered separate series within the Gen 4 umbrella, with a disproportionate amount of releases between series. And so because of that, there's not necessarily an even cleave that fully represents when the series hits the divide. So instead of looking to cleave where it makes the most sense numerically, let's instead place the divide where it makes the most sense generationally, which for me at least would be somewhere between Platinum and Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Platinum was a sort of middle child between the two, being somewhere between an update, like Heart Gold and Soul Silver were, and a journey through the Sinnoh region, like Diamond and Pearl were. So putting the divide here makes the most sense given the previous criteria set out. What does that mean for Sinnoh fans? It means that we can rejoice, my Fanforstic crew. We have until November of 2029 before the inevitability of age comes to take us in our sleep. Hooray! In spite of Gen 5 being the most mid-era that a generation can be, I have never heard anyone refer to a Gen 5 card as a mid-era card. Not even that I think people would disagree with you if you were to call Gen 5 mid-era, just that no one actually calls it by that title. I think this has less to do with a perceived lack of quality in terms of the cards of this generation, and more to do with the general demographics of people who are currently interested in Pokemon. Most people I see collecting cards are generally either young adults from their mid-20s to early 30s, or kids between the ages of 8 to 13. Not to say that there aren't teenage fans of the franchise, after all, I was once one myself, just that more fans fall into these two audiences than any other. Because of this, Gen 5 falls into an almost lost generation, where most of the people my age had stopped playing Pokemon by the time this game came out, and most of the kids currently weren't even alive to play it in the first place. I myself stopped playing Pokemon before Heart Gold and Soul Silver even released, and I can imagine a lot of other people my age were in a similar boat. While Gen 5 is fondly remembered today, it is also significantly less people's first generation than probably any of the other generations we'll be talking about. To put it another way, I appreciate Gen 5, I grew up with Gen 4. And that makes a huge difference in my perception and thoughts of the two generations. So while Gen 5 is objectively mid-era, and is the most mid-era set in this whole video, it exists in a sort of void regardless, where you wouldn't disagree with its categorization, but you also wouldn't put it there yourself unless someone else mentioned it. It's interesting too, because this generation has actually had a lot of influence on the card game, and serves as a great transition point in the franchise, starting out with cards that resembled the aesthetics of older generations, before introducing new ideas that later gens would iterate upon. But in order to really understand the impact Gen 5 had on the TCG, we need to see the way its influences inspired the later generations of the card game, starting with... Gen 6 can be best described as Gen 5's cooler, badder, fitted to the 9's younger brother. Everyone, young or old, is in unambiguous agreement that Gen 6 cards rule. EXs, full arts for both Pokemon and trainers, Radiant Collection cards, Radiant Collection full arts. It's not even like the concepts being introduced were new. Every single card type I just described was introduced in Gen 5, which is why I said Gen 5 had such a strong influence on the TCG. But this is where a lot of those concepts were solidified and expanded upon. Full art trainers were cool in Gen 5, don't get me wrong, but in Generation 6, they expanded the trainer cards to include more unique, interesting, and obscure characters, which added a lot to the game. Gen 5 reintroduced EXs, but just like the trainers, X and Y took this concept and ran laps around it, with the introduction of Mega EXs, Secret Rare EXs, Mega Full Art EXs, you get the idea. Even the Radiant Collection, which was stellar in both generations, still had some of the TCG's most iconic cards introduced in Gen 6. I'm talking about Sylveon EX, Gardevoir EX, Mega Gardevoir EX, Flareon EX, please stop staring at me like that, and so on. Gen 6 did also give us the introduction of break cards, which while very short-lived, were a cool idea visually that I'm sure if brought back in Gen 7 would have been dripped out to an even higher caliber. Point is, Gen 6 is proof that even though Gen 5 was kind of a sleeper in terms of popularity, its relevance is 100% undeniable, and how it led to us getting some of the best cards in the TCG. As for what category it's associated with, if you're wondering, Gen 6 is considered mid-era, for the same reasons Gen 4 is considered mid-era. They're both one gen apart from Gen 5. Although unlike Generation 4, where most people would agree it belongs in the mid-era class, calling a Gen 6 card mid-era might get you some funny looks. Remember that Gen 3 is considered the mid-era benchmark, so the further you pull away from Gen 3, the less a generation is going to be perceived as mid-era. Although given how old the generation is at this point, I don't think anyone is willing to pose it as a modern gen either. Oh boy, back to the fun zone, huh? See, Gen 7, like Gen 3, is kind of the odd one out when it comes to what era of Pokemon people place it in. Many would consider Gen 7 to be a modern set, since Gen 9 is still considered relatively new, and it brought a lot of ideas to the card game that later sets would continue with. While GXs didn't end up making the transition into Sword and Shield, the concept of cards having full art, alt art, and secret rare variations did, something that became popularized in the Sun and Moon era. Trainer full arts also solidified their design here. Secret rares from Cosmic Eclipse were very clearly used as the basis for gallery cards in sets like Lost Origin and Crown Zenith, although if we're going to be honest, both are clearly taking inspiration from the full art X and Y promos. Shiny Vault cards were a cool spin on how shinies get presented in the TCG, so much so that this design got re-explored a few years later with the set Paldean Fates. It's clear that Sun and Moon had a lot for later sets to iterate upon, So shouldn't it be an open and shut case that these cards fit into the modern era of the TCG? Well, just like Gen 3, there are arguments on either side for whether or not we can truly consider it to be modern. For those in favor of calling them modern, I can see where they're coming from. Pokemon cards from Gen 9 do still look a lot like their Gen 7 counterparts. There are obvious differences, especially looking at these cards in person, but when you look at a Sun and Moon card, it still feels new. It just doesn't feel right separating them from Gens 8 and 9, when they definitely fit the aesthetic of these cards more than the generations prior. But see, the thing about Gen 7 is that while it feels new to a lot of us still, myself included, the unfortunate truth is that Gen 7 started over 8 years ago, closer to a decade ago than to today. Even the last set from Sun and Moon, Cosmic Eclipse, came out close to 6 years ago. And I think that 6 years is a heck of a long time to consider something as still being modern. Reminder that the PlayStation 5 came out in 2020, and Sony are already considering moving on to the PlayStation 6, even though they forgot to put any games on the PlayStation 5 in the first place. No, I'm serious. This is the entire list of console exclusives for the PlayStation 5. Half of these games aren't even out yet. In fact, one of these games is just the same game listed twice, under slightly different titles. That being said, I don't think I can comfortably consider these cards to be mid-era, either. At this point, if we were to put them in the mid-era, that would mean mid-era encapsulates 5 of the 9 generations in the series, which to me seems kind of excessive. I would honestly consider putting Gen 6 and 7 together into their own category, since one was a pseudo send-off to the mid-era, and one represented a new age for the TCG. Maybe even calling it a pre-modern era, if you're uncreative like I am. But no matter which way you swing it, Gen 7 is in a very weird spot. The divide, if you will. And so because of that, I won't put it in any era definitively. All I will say is that Gen 7 has a lot to chew on. Bet you weren't expecting this guy to show up, huh? After all, I did say, you see, while everyone is in agreement that Gens 1 and 2 are considered vintage, so what gives? You may be asking yourself, is Gen 2 vintage or not? Well, while most of Gen 2 is considered vintage, there were a series of cards released after the Neo series but before the EX series that many view as mid-era. In fact, you might have even recalled me talking about it earlier in the video. Don't remember their name? Let's see if this helps. Guys, you know this is just my opinion, right? I love the e-reader cards, trust you me, but love is not on the docket for today's menu. Are these cards mid-era or vintage? Let's get into it. See, the thing about e-readers is while they're definitely not Gen 3 cards, calling them Gen 2 cards feels equally weird. Look at any cards from the previous Gen 2 sets, and you can see a huge difference between how cards were presented prior to e-readers and after e-readers. That being said, card designs changing during the generation isn't anything new for the franchise. Gen 3 had card layout changes, Gen 5 had card layout changes. These things are pretty normal for the card game. Also important to note are that e-reader cards were Wizards of the Coast's last set with Pokemon, and seeing as Wizards were considered endemic of the vintage era as a whole, it stands to reason that this final set from them would be considered vintage as well. Can you call them mid-era regardless? Sure. In fact, I think many people do without even realizing it, seeing how similar they look to Ruby and Sapphire cards. Do I personally think they're too old to be mid-era? I mean, if Gen 3 is in the divide, then e-readers stand no chance. Let's just be honest with ourselves. Still, these cards are incredibly iconic to the card game, so I had to talk about them for at least a little bit more. Looking at the situation we find ourselves in, I can't describe how conflicted I feel about this whole thing. While Gen 4 was my first generation, Gen 3 cards were still in stores when I started collecting, and having to grapple with the cards I had in my collection being considered vintage just doesn't feel right. Because of that, and because even I am susceptible to denial, I think it's worth considering taking a look at things from a different perspective. Up to this point, we've been looking at things from the TCG side of Pokemon. I think we should take a moment to look at the generations from the perspective of the games, to see if maybe that can help shift our perspectives a bit. See, something that a friend pointed out to me while I was discussing this video idea with them is that people haven't been satisfied with the games for a long time. I think the last Pokemon game that most people are in agreement was good was Pokemon Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire back in...
Oh my god! Oh my god!
Sun and Moon has its detractors, yours truly included. Sword and Shield might be the most hated game in the series, yours truly not included, but that's a discussion for later. Scarlet and Violet... yeah. The point is, Pokemon hasn't had a universally acclaimed game in years. Because of that, when people use the term mid-era, I think deep down, beyond the colloquialisms and beyond the surface, what they're really getting at is that the mid-era represented a sort of golden age, when the games were still considered good in all of their rose-tinted glory, before the fart-tinted glasses known as adulthood and taxes arrived at people's door. But I think it's a little more than that. Beyond just nostalgia, Gen 3 is a sort of middle ground between the modern Pokemon titles and the older titles. Or, at least it had set the foundation for that transition to occur. Let me explain. The Pokemon games can be pretty cleanly split into two distinct eras, the 2D titles and the 3D titles. The 2D era encapsulates Gens 1 through 5, while the 3D era encapsulates Gens 6 through 9. If you were to ask most people which era was the better of the two, the 2D era would be chosen time and time again. While there are definitely people that enjoyed and even loved games like X and Y, Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, and even newer titles like Scarlet and Violet and Legends Arceus, I would be incredibly surprised to hear someone say they prefer these titles to the older ones. So why do people prefer the 2D titles so much? Well, let's see what they bring to the table. Give me 2 years and I'll get back to this one. Gen 3 was Game Freak's first attempt at shaking up the Pokemon formula. For starters, Ruby and Sapphire were the first titles to be officially directed by Junichi Masuda and not Satoshi Tajiri, who many would consider the visionary behind the first 2 generations. Hoenn as a region had a lot setting it apart from previous regions. A regional Pokédex that included only 67 of the original 251, a heavier emphasis on the water routes, dear god, 2 villain teams instead of 1, double battles that served as a twist on the standard battle formula, your dad is actually present in the story, something they still don't even really do in modern games, rivals are now nice instead of being interesting characters, Pokemon pageants in the battle frontier have been added to serve as fun activities outside of the main game, legendaries have more impact on the main story, you get the idea. Gen 3 tried a lot of new things, and that desire to experiment helped it resonate with a new audience of fans who would continue with the series from that point forward. Gen 4 didn't innovate as much in regards to new features, but it did have, as well as the first use of 3D in the series for things like the environments and legendaries. It was also the first game to introduce Wi-Fi for battles and trading, meaning that you didn't need to use the link cable anymore if you wanted to play with friends. It was also the series' first use of the special physical split for Pokemon moves, based on the type of move being used, not on the type of move itself. What I mean is, ice moves were always considered special type moves, whether that be Ice Beam, Blizzard, Avalanche, or even Ice Punch. In Gen 4, whether a move was physical or special was determined by the move itself, not by the type of move it was. Beyond new features, there's just something to Gen 4 that makes it so memorable as a region. I don't know how to put it better, but the vibes of Gen 4 are simply immaculate. It also has Infernape, so like, it's kind of the best generation in the series by default. Gen 5 is where all hell broke loose. Junichi Masuda said, "Wanna see me soft reboot the series? Wanna see me do it again?" Except this time, he was not messing around. All new cast of characters, all new cast of Pokemon, no returning Pokemon until the post-game. First attempt at telling a more complex story. First region to have its design inspired outside of Japan, this time being based on the United States. And most importantly for this video, a far heavier emphasis on presentation. Style was a major aspect of Gen 5's appeal, and the results speak for themselves. Okay, so it's pretty clear to see why people like these older gens so much. Each generation tried to approach the series from a new angle, and I think those attempts only became more appreciated with each passing year. From this point forward, people seem to have more and more issues with the games. Gen 6 has no post-game, Gen 7 took away traditional gyms, Gen 8 is too linear, Gen 9 looks like an asset flip. Most of the discussion around these games focuses more on the negatives than the positives. So are these games just literally worse than previous titles? After all, based on their reputation, you would certainly believe so. Gen 3 is mid-era because it was in the middle of when the games were still good. Case closed. Well, like we've been discussing this whole video, the situation is a little more complicated than that. See, something you might not know about Pokemon games is that there has never been a real period where the games weren't being criticized. Gen 3 was heavily criticized when it came out for the simple graphics, the water routes, the lack of backwards compatibility with previous titles, the boring rival, the easy gameplay, you get the idea. Gen 4 was criticized for all the HMs, the slow gameplay. Oh my god. Die already. Die already. Oh my god. Gen 5 was heavily criticized for the lackluster story, the visuals not fully transitioning into 3D, which, yes, is a very funny criticism in retrospect, the new designs being weird and stupid, don't let the haters wear you down, Vanillish, I still love you, and the postgame being a nightmare of poor leveling design. Even Gen 1, Pokemon Red and Blue were rated a 7.2 by Nintendo Power, Nintendo's official gaming magazine in the 90s. By modern game review standards, they basically called it the worst game ever made. So what gives? If Pokemon games have always been criticized since their inception, then was there ever truly a golden age to begin with? Well, the thing about Pokemon as a franchise is that it actually hasn't changed that much over the course of its run. What's changed is you, dear viewer. See, a lot of the people that look back on games like Ruby and Sapphire so fondly are the same people that played it as children. If Red and Blue were your first Pokemon games, you probably have a higher opinion of them than someone who grew up with X and Y. Because you were young enough to enjoy the games without hearing the endless waves of criticism against them, you were able to enjoy the titles for what they were, and not for what others expected them to be. As you grow up, however, things change. Especially in my generation's case, we grew up alongside the internet, and so we experienced a paradigm shift in the way that people interact with one another, while our brains were still developing. That led to me experiencing a lot of great things, like early 2010s YouTube and Funbrain. It also led to me experiencing a lot of bad things, like the Scary Maze game and early 2010s YouTube. Things change, and as a result, issues you might not have noticed as a child ended up being a bigger problem when you came back to the title as an adult. Oh my god, are you still alive? You changed. You expanded your horizon on the media you watched, gave yourself the opportunity to push your perception on what art can be, and as a result, your standards for a work provided changed with you. And while that change might have led to you seeing your childhood classics in a new light, you still might have been willing to accept any issues they had as just being a product of their age. Cut to the games releasing after childhood, and you might start to notice yourself being a little less charitable with the titles. More and more of those minor nuisances start to pop up, and while you might have been able to ignore the flaws in Gen 3, by the time you get to Gen 9, those rose-tinted glasses you've had since childhood are gone. You can now approach the series and see it for what it is, and not for what it was. The funny thing is, in 10 years, you're gonna see videos talking about how great Pokemon Sword and Shield were, and how Scarlet and Violet were unappreciated masterpieces, and in that same breath, you'll hear those reviewers talk about how disappointing Gens 14 and 15 were, and how Shrimpy should have been given a Stage 5 evolution, or whatever else there will be to complain about at the time. Life is a never-ending cycle of complaining and talking about how great things used to be. Pokemon games are just another victim of this. But that doesn't have to be the end of the world. Even if Pokemon never comes out with another great game, we can have some solace in knowing that at least the Pokemon cards they'll be releasing are going to be sick. Vintage era, mid-era, modern. In my opinion, they're all pretty sweet. Sure, I miss when reverse hollows made your eyes bleed, and yeah, EXs in their old designs were pretty rad, but you know what? The new black and white holofoils are kinda rad, and IRs have allowed for some of the best card artworks to date. The great thing about Pokemon is no matter which one is your favorite, Pokemon will give it some love sooner or later. Is your favorite Pokemon Mienfoo? Clamperl? How about Spidops? If any were the case, then boy do I have some good news for you. And so what if Gen 3 is old and busted? Who cares anyway? The cards are sick, and they're loved now more than ever before. As new generations of kids get into the series, they're gonna have their own eras in Pokemon to love, much like how we love Gens 3 and 4 right now. And you know what? There's something about that I think is kinda neat. In fact, you could even say it's kinda beautiful. Have a good night, people, and try not to explode.